You probably laughed at Hobo back then, but try looking at it now and it feels completely different. What once seemed funny now just feels weird and kind of uncomfortable. At its core, Hobo was extremely simple. You moved your character from one side of the screen to the other and fought enemies. That was it. No complicated systems, no long tutorials, no learning curve that would scare people away. Anyone could pick it up in seconds and start playing. That accessibility played a huge role in its popularity, especially in a time when people were just looking for quick entertainment. But the real hook was not the gameplay itself. It was how the game chose to present that gameplay. Instead of normal attacks or weapons, Hobo leaned heavily into gross-out humor. The attacks were designed to shock players, make them laugh, or just make them say, "What did I just see?" It was different, and that difference made it stand out in a sea of similar games. There was also this feeling that the game was breaking rules. It did things that felt like they should not be allowed, especially compared to more traditional games. That gave it a rebellious kind of energy. It felt like something you were not supposed to be playing, which somehow made it even more fun. As the series continued, things only got more extreme. Each new game tried to add more moves, more chaos, and more ridiculous situations. New combos, new enemies, and new settings kept appearing. It was always trying to top itself, and for a while that worked. People kept coming back just to see how far it would go next. The first game starts very simple. You play as Hobo, a homeless man, and it begins with him sleeping in a junkyard until a police officer hits him to wake him up. Hobo fights back, and that is where everything begins. You go around the city beating up people and police, and it stays pretty grounded. By the end, he gets arrested and sent to prison. The first 4 games keep things like this. It is all set in streets, prisons, and regular places, even if it gets a bit crazy. But after the 4th game, everything changes. Suddenly, aliens show up, and the story starts going way over the top. From there, it keeps getting bigger, going from the city to space, and even into places like heaven and hell. The scale just keeps rising with every game. With each new setting came more absurd abilities. The moves became more exaggerated, the enemies became more bizarre, and the situations became harder to take seriously. It was like the game was trying to outdo itself every single time, no matter what. At some point, the story stopped feeling like a simple setup and started feeling like a parody of itself. What began as a basic beat-em-up turned into something much more chaotic and unpredictable. That unpredictability was fun at first, but over time, it started to feel a bit too much. The problem with constant escalation is that it raises expectations every time. When everything is extreme, nothing feels special anymore. The original charm came from how unexpected the game was. But when every sequel tried to be even more outrageous, that surprise slowly disappeared. Instead of feeling fresh, it started to feel repetitive in a different way. A huge part of Hobo's identity was its humor. It relied heavily on crude and bodily jokes to get reactions out of players. Back then, that kind of humor was common in online spaces. It was seen as edgy, bold, and sometimes just plain funny because it was so unexpected. Today, that same humor does not land the same way. Tastes have changed, and so have expectations. What people found hilarious years ago can now feel uncomfortable or unnecessary. It is not just about being sensitive. It is about how humor evolves over time. What once felt creative can now feel repetitive or forced. There are also bigger changes in how games are made and shared. Platforms now have stricter rules about what content is acceptable. Games like Hobo would have a much harder time existing in the same form today. That alone shows how much things have shifted. There is also a clear difference between edgy fun and something that just feels off. Back then, players were more willing to overlook certain things because the experience was new. Now, with so many options available, people expect more thoughtful design and humor that does not rely only on shock value. When you look past the humor, the gameplay itself starts to show its weaknesses. The combat loop is very repetitive. You fight waves of enemies, move forward, and repeat. At first, the unique attacks make it feel different, but over time, the structure stays the same. As the series continued, some games added more difficulty in ways that were not always satisfying. Losing progress, dealing with frustrating enemy patterns, and repeating sections could turn the experience into a grind. What once felt fun started to feel tiring. Another issue was balance. Some mechanics, especially weapons, became too powerful. They made certain parts of the game much easier than intended, removing any real challenge. When that happens, the gameplay loses tension and becomes less engaging. When players were younger, these problems were easy to ignore. The novelty of the game was enough to carry the experience. But looking back now, it is easier to see the cracks. The humor and shock value were doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Without them, the gameplay feels much more basic than it first appeared. At the start, shock value feels powerful. It grabs your attention instantly and makes the experience feel different from everything else. That is exactly what helped Hobo stand out in the first place. The first time you saw its strange attacks and over-the-top moments, it felt unexpected and honestly kind of wild. That surprise carried a lot of the experience, and it made even simple gameplay feel exciting. But shock value has a limit. The more you see it, the less effective it becomes. What once made you laugh or react suddenly becomes predictable. That is what happens when novelty wears off in a long-running series. Hobo kept using the same style of humor and the same type of mechanics again and again. Each sequel tried to go further, but it was still built on the same idea. After a while, players already knew what to expect, so the impact was not the same. The jokes started to feel repeated instead of surprising. The mechanics, even when expanded, still followed the same pattern. You moved forward, fought enemies, and used exaggerated attacks. It did not matter if the setting changed or if new abilities were added. The core experience stayed very similar. Without that initial shock to carry it, the repetition became much more noticeable. At that point, the game started to feel like a regular beat-em-up underneath everything. The unique theme was still there, but it was no longer enough to hide the simplicity of the gameplay. When you strip away the surface, you are left with a structure that is not very different from many other games in the genre. One of the biggest reasons Hobo feels different today is because the audience has changed. People are more aware of tone and context now. They pay more attention to how content is presented and what it is trying to say. Back then, a lot of flash games were made quickly and shared freely, so there was less focus on how they might be received by a wider audience. Now, things are different. Games reach a much larger and more diverse group of players. Because of that, there is more discussion around what is appropriate and what is not. Humor that once felt harmless or edgy can now feel out of place or unnecessary. It is not just about being more careful. It is about understanding that players expect more thoughtful design. There are also clear platform rules today that did not exist in the same way before. Many modern platforms have strict guidelines about content. Games like Hobo would likely face limitations or would need to be changed significantly to fit those standards. That alone shows how much the environment has shifted since the Flash era. Another big change is the rise of polished indie games. Back then, Flash games were raw and experimental. That was part of their charm. Developers could try anything, and sometimes that led to very creative ideas. Today, indie games still have creativity, but they are often more refined. They focus on strong mechanics, storytelling, and presentation. Players have come to expect that level of quality. Because of all this, Hobo feels tied to a very specific moment in internet history. It represents a time when things were less structured and more chaotic. That does not make it bad, but it does make it feel out of place when compared to modern games. Even with all its flaws, Hobo is still worth remembering. It is a part of gaming history that reflects a unique time. For many people, it was one of those games they played during breaks, shared with friends, or discovered randomly while browsing. That kind of experience is hard to recreate today. The series also played a role in defining what browser gaming could be. It showed that games did not need big budgets or complex systems to get attention. Sometimes, all it took was a strong idea and the willingness to push boundaries. Even if those boundaries were pushed too far at times, the creativity behind it is still worth acknowledging. There is also something honest about how chaotic the game is. It does not try to be perfect or polished. It simply commits to its idea fully, no matter how strange it might be. That kind of confidence is rare, and it is part of why the game stayed memorable. At the same time, it is important to be realistic about it. The gameplay has issues, the humor does not age well, and the repetition becomes clear over time. It is not a perfect series by any means, but it does not need to be.